Well, welcome everybody to this evening of neighborhood stories sharing in celebration of Earth Day. I am Sarah, and I'm with Hives for Humanity Society. My pronouns are she, her, and they, and I am sitting here in my office in Strathcona, where Hives for Humanity has its home base. I'm kind of sitting up in a cedar tree that I can see out my window. I've been watching the rain and people coming and going. I walked here under cherry blossoms and crows and across the train tracks. And from my garden where Solomon's seal and bluebells and bleeding hearts are coming up this spring. I work in the downtown east side alongside community members here who are gardeners and who are beekeepers and who open up green spaces and care for green spaces that feed and give shelter to the bees. And I'm really honored to do this work, to work alongside those folks, to work with the people, plants, and pollinators that call this land home. This land that is unceded land of Musqueam and Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh. Those peoples of those nations who have been stewarding this land and who have been hosting here on this land since time out of mind. I'm an uninvited guest here. My ancestry goes back to Larne, Ireland, which is in Northern Ireland. I've been feeling really blessed to be reading some of the memoirs of my grandfather, Common, and his journey through those hills and waters of Ireland over to Wabanaki Confederacy lands in Sherbrooke and then in Montreal, and then my own journey here and there, but eventually landing here in Vancouver. So as I've been reading those memories of land and ocean in Ireland, I've really been thinking about my land and ocean memories here. This is where I feel most connected to community when I'm on the land and working with my hands in the soil and the bees. And I think that's what brings a lot of us together, is that connection to land, the food that it produces, and the community that we can grow around food. So welcome everyone. And if you are interested and able, if you would put into the chat where you're coming from and how you're connecting to land. And one of the things that we often ask our folks in community at Hives for Humanity to do is to share something that they're observing that is in bloom. So what's blooming in your gardens? What are you growing? What are you seeing in the city? If you can share that in the chat, we will sort of be harvesting and creating story from the chat so that we can learn about each other a bit through our observations and our connections. So while that is happening, ooh, Dogwood, awesome. Hey, Jill, old neighbor. While that is happening and while you're putting in those seasonal observations, we are going to tonight have 3 story sharers presenting from the Burrardview Community Association, Barbara, Shane, and Kate. Barbara's going to be sharing some story around the BCA history, Shane around environmental and community advocacy along the inlet, and Kate around how the community came together to respond to violence that was happening with the lights competition. And after that, I'm going to come back and share some of the stories of the magic from the honeybees and some of the work that Hives for Humanity does in community, which, yeah, we're hoping to share more out into different neighborhoods, like from the downtown east side, building connection into different neighborhoods. So we're going to move to our panel now. So I'll welcome Barbara, Shane, and Kate, and I'll pass it over to the 3 of you. Thank you so much for putting together these stories of your work and being here to share them in community tonight.
Good, thank you, Sarah. I'm Barb Cusack, and I have been a long-term resident, hate to say how long, in the neighborhood, and also involved in community, especially the community association. So I'm going to talk about the history of the community association, and I have to refer to my notes because I'm not good at talking off the top of my head. So the Burrardview Community Association represents the neighborhood north of McGill Street, from Wall and Trinity Streets on the west to New Brighton Park at the east. The association has existed under various names since 1978. In 1978, a group of Wall Street neighbors concerned about the stability of the Wall Street cliff got together to set up the Wall Street Community Cliff Project. They formed the Burrardview Wall Street Residents Association, became a registered society and applied for federal funding under the Canada Works program. Funding secured, the association hired a geotechnical firm to study the bank and prepare a report. The book detailing the geography of Wall Street Bank is held by the current association. Very fragile book, but it's a really interesting book. The CP railway tracks run along the base of Wall Street Cliff. Terminal Dock and Columbia Grain Elevator were the only port businesses below the houses. For many years, the port, the railway, and the neighborhood lived next to each other in relative peace. That all changed in the 1980s when the port started to expand eastward. First, a poorly run, polluting, fly ash spewing garbage burner was moved to the foot of Nanaimo Street below Meditation Park. The Burrardview Wall Street Residents Association, with the support of the City Hall, had the burner shut down and moved elsewhere. Then the port authorized Elders Grain, a large Australian grain company, to build a new grain elevator below the houses at the Kamloops Street End Park. Wall Street was and is one of the view corridors designated by the city. Neighbors became concerned over the impact the new grain elevator would have on the views. The association rallied the neighborhood. A campaign against the port and Elders Grain resulted in the city rezoning the port area east of Victoria Drive from heavy industry to comprehensive development. Height restrictions were introduced, and the height of the grain elevator was reduced to 100 feet, which is the height of the bank along that part of Wall Street. That elevator was eventually taken down. Around the same time, CP Rail started using the tracks below the houses as a rail yard. Heavy haul engines were parked and left to idle for hours, causing excessive noise and diesel fumes. That started an ongoing fight and eventually mediated talks with the CP Rail to reduce their negative impact on the neighborhood. An official complaint to the Canadian Transport Agency was prepared by the association, but was later withdrawn for a variety of reasons. After the fight with Lafarge Cement, which Shane will tell you about shortly, the port became tired of the bad publicity and agreed to sit down to talk with representatives from the City of Vancouver, the now Burrardview Neighbourhood Association, and in 2003, a working group was established to address compatibility issues between the residential neighborhood and the working port. After 4 years of meeting and talks, in 2007, the East Vancouver Portland Plan was approved and a liaison committee established. Community representatives continue to sit on that liaison committee. Some other activities the association has been involved with are stopping crime and improving safety in Burrardview Park, and choosing a tenant for the heritage building there. Supporting the proposal to move the North Mental Health Team to a building on East Hastings Street, and organizing several community workshops such as emergency preparedness. I didn't want to talk just about all the opposing things that we'd done, but I'm not going to talk in detail about those other things. And I will now turn it over to Shane to talk about the fight against Lafarge Cement.
Thanks, Barb, and thank you for organizing this. It really is a great thing to do, and I really appreciate the opportunity to participate. I'm here at my home in Burrardview in the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, and proud and privileged to live in their territory and to live, work, and to play here. And our community of Burrardview is very much part of those unceded territories. There's been a whole array, and Barb told you about some, and Kate will tell you about others. There's been a whole array of issues in that have over time rallied this community together. It's been part of what has built a sense of community here that I think has been sustained and has lasted. And one of the real big pieces of that started in 1998. It was Halloween, I think, of 1998 when neighbors of ours, acquaintances, they weren't friends, but they came by and stopped by and asked if we had heard about this concrete plant proposal beside New Brighton Park. We hadn't heard anything about it. So we talked, and a number of people who lived in the community were concerned. It happened that very shortly after that conversation, the proponents, and to understand where this came from, the proponents held a small meeting. Now, where this all came from was that the port had a desire to expand access into the port. So they were putting in place a new overpass in. They didn't have the property to do that. And the city had some property and the port had some property, and Lafarge, through a numbered company, had bought a gypsum plant called West Rock that bordered New Brighton Park. The three of them got together and they did a deal that swapped land. And what that did was allowed a little bit of park expansion on the west side. It provided for the port all of the land it needed to put the new access roads in for trucks into the port. And the tacit agreement, though it wasn't made public, was that Lafarge would get to build a concrete batch plant there. And so that was the initiative. Nobody knew about this until it started to come up. There was a little bit of signage, and this meeting happened in an abandoned building with port representatives and Lafarge representatives at what had been the offices of West Rock and was now an abandoned building. And we met there. And at the first time, a handful of community people really began to understand a little bit about what this proposal was about. And it raised an awful lot of concerns for people. So a group of us got together and began to talk about that. We had lots of capacity in our community. So the first thing we did was some initial research. And we learned about dust. And we learned about the impacts of dust and noise, the impact of that dust, particularly on the park and on park users, and the health issues related to that. What we learned very quickly is almost no work had been done to look at impacts on marine habitat along the shoreline. That just wasn't an issue. And as there was growing desire to enhance the marine habitat around New Brighton Park, there wasn't work being done there. And the park itself, New Brighton Park is the only park east of Main Street in Vancouver, waterfront park east of Main Street, and it has the only outdoor pool in all of East Vancouver. The result was that the community came together very quickly. There were people who really wanted us to make the argument about it affecting their views. And we gently dismissed those people, quite frankly. And we decided this was going to be about noise, about dust, about marine habitat, and about protecting the integrity of this park. We started at that time, we brought together the community very quickly. We also knew that the Burrardview Neighbourhood Association, which was critical to this, was not going to be able to do this on its own. So we structured the Stop Lafarge Coalition, and we're able to draw a wide range of people who didn't necessarily live in this neighborhood, but who shared this issue. They were park users, they were people concerned about environmental issues, people concerned about health issues, and people who just didn't like to see communities imposed on in the way that would occur here. I recall back to when this all started. The Lafarge had told us in 1998, when we had this meeting with them, that they expected to start construction in 6 months. That was their plan. I would note for you that they started construction 10 years later in 2008 at a different site. So it became a challenge, but the community came together. And the way that we came together was a group of mostly people in this neighborhood, 8 to 12 people, who really formed the core of this. But we broadened very quickly to capture the rest of the community. We created a system to engage people. We had a distribution system for information that ran from the water to First Avenue Boundary Road to Commercial Drive. And we could hand deliver within 2 or 3 days to that whole community. And this was a structure set up by people involved in the community who understood how to do that. And we networked people to be able to help with that. We had a communication strategy that allowed us to communicate through newsletters and other ways. We had a media and a media strategy to make sure that this issue didn't fall out of people's minds. And we had strong research capacity. And interestingly, all of this was from people in the neighborhood, volunteers. Nobody got paid to do anything. Everybody just did this work in order to protect the integrity of the community moving forward. But we knew we had to have the community with us. We also knew that people were not necessarily going to want to be overwhelmed by the expectations of their commitment. So we measured it in a way to make sure people could be involved as they wanted to. There was a whole group of people who handled that door-to-door distribution, and they would do it on a moment's notice. There were people who would come out to meetings, and we turned out on a regular basis 500 people to meetings on a regular basis. We tried not to do it more frequently than necessary because you can only call people so many times to that, but people came every time. We talked to people about writing letters and making phone calls. And what we did is we worked really hard to create a system where people could be as engaged and as involved as their time allowed them to be, and to feel valued for that in their involvement. And we were very successful at doing that. The result of that was we also came up with this great campaign around lawn signs. And we had literally people bought the lawn signs for $10 a piece because
I think everybody has experienced Shane freezing, so we'll just wait for him, right? That's happening for everyone.
Yes.
Okay. This is classic Zoom.
Kate's frozen too, and they're in the same place. So I wonder if it's
an internet issue. Oh, we were right in the too. Well, we will just adjust, I think. This does happen all the time, and internet cuts in and out. They're having to join the call again. So I think what we'll do is we will come back to that story, and I can share a little bit about bees. I was just hearing this thing in that story that I was so excited to hear, which is that piece of feeling valued and being met where you're at. So I was really edge of my seat there on Shane's story, and I can see some of you were too, because you're all leaning in as soon as he paused. So we will get them back, and in the meantime, I will hop on and share a bit about Hives for Humanity. I was making a couple of notes during some of those presentations. Barbara, thank you for that history. I lived in the community on Trinity Street for a year, and so much of this history was unknown to me. So just the value of sharing story, and even hearing in Shane's story there that like neighbors talking to each other, like what happens when we share story and what happens when we talk to each other, and how food and gardens can be a way of bringing people together. And that is really what we're doing in Hives for Humanity in the downtown east side, is like thinking about how when we open doors to gardens, when we open gates to gardens, when we give people gloves and a hand tool and some seeds, how we can grow hope together, how we can grow community care together, and how we can take action together around stewarding this environment, and around creating communities that are inclusive of all ways of knowing and being, all kinds of people and plants and pollinators alike. So I'm going to share a screen, and MP, please just interrupt me if those two come back in, and I can skip back out. So hopefully everyone is seeing my screen. And yeah, like I said at the beginning, I'm with Hives for Humanity Society, and we were founded in 2012. So I was writing down some of those dates in the BCA presentation. 1998 is a year after I moved here as a 13-year-old from Scotland. And in 1978, I definitely wasn't around then. So feeling honored to have this this depth of time in the room tonight, and then to share where I am now and where maybe we all are now. So this is a honeybee on the finger of one of our community members, Ian, and he was sharing a little bit of honeycomb back to a honeybee at one of our harvest celebrations. So one of the ways that we work in community is to bring people together around food. And so, yeah, MP, are they back?
Yeah, they're back. I don't know. Do you want to just see if they want? Yeah.
Yeah, we'll just bear with us for a second. Just these tech woes. Let's see, Shane, are you there?
I am.
I just kind of hopped in and started talking to you.
Yeah, good save. Good save.
We can hop back to you because we were definitely all edge of seat before you dropped off. Does that make sense?
Yeah, why don't we just go back and we'll go again. I'll start off where I stopped, and I don't know how that is. It's the wonders of technology and Zoom.
Yeah, we're all there with you.
Yeah.
You just started about volunteers and feeling valued, and that's when it froze.
Yeah. Well, and so what happened is that we were able to engage people very much in this process, and they embraced it, and they embraced it as part of the community. And it became what we found as we were doing this work was the important thing wasn't to overwhelm people who wanted to be active with things to talk about organization and that. We were not particularly democratic, actually, in terms of the core group, but we were very accountable in terms of the strategies that were developed were brought to this larger group on a couple of instances. We distributed a regular newsletter that talked about what we were doing. We were all accessible to people, and folks had their confidence that we were taking this in a direction that they wanted. Our intentions were clear about what it is we were looking to do. We had done good research. We had an excellent research team, so we could make a strong case. We limited the number of community meetings to those that we required in order to be effective, either internally or externally. As I said, we limited some of the activism to let people be as active as they choose to be, and we encourage who wanted to do more to get involved. We also linked to the broader community. Kiwassa was a huge part of this, the neighborhood house, because we needed money, and we were just an ad hoc group. So Kiwassa actually took donations on our behalf, and were able to use their charitable status to do that. And then they would flow those donations that were meant for us through to us. And so we had a few $1,000s as people would put up money of their own. Joy McPhail's office, who was the MLA at the time, her office was very supportive and helped us in terms of producing materials and access. And the Hastings Community Association, which runs the community center, and the Grandview Woodland Area Council, both as neighborhood groups, were very supportive of the work we were doing. We targeted the people that we needed to target, the local community, park users, and environmentalists. We put this massive sign campaign in place. The result of this is we forced the port to put a project advisory committee in place and to commit to paying attention to them. That happened, and this was a group of 3 eminent individuals with a budget, and they held meetings, including a community meeting where we turned 500 people out to talk to them. They received about 80 submissions from the community, and that committee recommended, I believe unanimously, that this should not go ahead. So in August of 2000, we had killed the New Brighton proposal, essentially. And we were celebrating that after 2 years. But what we knew is that this probably wasn't over. And a year later, Lafarge and the port came back with the Sterling Shipyard proposal at the foot of Victoria Drive. People in our community, it didn't affect the park any longer. It was in the heart of the industrial port. It was a little ways away from where most of the people who were involved had been. But we made the commitment that we would pursue this cause there at that site as well, working with the people there, and we did that. It was much more challenging. Many of the arguments we had were not good. Some of the environmental and marine habitat arguments were absolutely still solid. There were eagles who nested in that area who were going to be imposed upon by this. So we had to, though, demonstrate, because we knew that the port and Lafarge didn't believe we had the same moral authority that we had had in the New Brighton fight in terms of rallying the community. And they had brought a fellow named Ted Hughes, who some of you may know. He's past ombudsperson for British Columbia, one of the eminent conciliators, mediators, investigators in the country. Mr. Hughes passed away a few years ago. But they hired him and called a big public meeting, the port. And so we were in a bit of a box because we couldn't not participate. But we knew that this was just leading to what would not have been a good process and drag it out. So we did something at a very big risk. We said, okay, we'll participate. And we actively pursued turning people out to the meeting. We turned out about 500 people, but we had a plan from the beginning. And at the last minute, as everybody was there, I got up to speak as the first speaker. And I said the process was not legitimate. There were about 8, the media was there in force, and we walked every one of those 500 people out of the room with me. I walked out after speaking first, and they all walked out with me. And organizing that without letting anybody know it was going to happen. It was organized at the site by a small group of people that we had met with 2 hours before the meeting to say, this is what we're going to do, and you got to help us. I do remember as we were getting ready, because we were very nervous about whether this would work or not. And I said to Kate and to Barb and to others that were there, I said, if I get up and I do this and I make my statement and I walk out the door and nobody comes with me, you'll find me at the pub on Hastings Street, drowned in my sorrows. But we walked everybody out. And that was really critical because it demonstrated that we still were the voice for the community on this issue. Where that led to was then 3 court cases. We spent 5 years in court. We split the first 2 cases, the Supreme Court of BC and the appeal court. And then on a constitutional case that the province brought, somewhat on a different matter, it ended up in the Supreme Court of Canada. 5 years in court. It also, when we lost the second case, we lost badly. And the courts awarded costs against us. So they were going to make the neighborhood association pay for the port and Lafarge's court costs and lawyers. At that point, we had basically abolished the neighborhood association, which was the Burrardview Neighborhood Association, and created the Burrardview Community Association. We had some lawyers tell us how to protect everybody from personal liability. And the port and Lafarge, to their credit, announced very quickly that they would not be pursuing any of those costs. So that's what happened there moving forward. And ultimately, it did get built in 2008. But they built the most environmentally sound concrete batch plant in Canada at that time. I remember I was the member of the legislature at that time, and I was invited to take a personal tour with the president of the port and the president of Lafarge Canada. And they showed me how it all worked. And I thanked them because probably my involvement in this process led to me becoming the MLA. But the interesting thing is, for all those years afterwards, I never got a complaint from the local community about the plant. We had done the job, and they in fact had put back in place nest protection for the eagles who did come back, which was kind of cool that all happened. So this really was, my reflection is that activism does work. It is important. You need to be generous with each other. You need to be as gracious as you can. It can't be ideological. You know, we have people in this community, obviously people like myself, who was an NDP elected, who was very partisan, but people who would have never voted for the NDP if their life would rested on it, who were part of that core group. And we worked very hard to make this about the issues that were important to people, take the ideology out of it, and really work on what made most sense. We also were very clear, and the Sterling fight was part of that, is they came to our support. We were not going to abandon that part of the community, a little bit poorer part of the community, a little less organized. We had no intention of abandoning them at that time as we move forward to get this done. So it really was a remarkable event. And it established in this community, I think, a sense of ownership for people in the community, that when you come together, you can support each other. You can do this in a way that makes sense, and you can be successful in protecting the integrity of where you live and how you want to live. So that was very positive. And we've had, you know, other successes since then, but I do think that really has to be seen as what made this work. Is that everybody came together with good faith. We trusted each other. We did our best not to breach that trust in how we move forward with this. And we demonstrated, and it's always kind of remained with me, that people who are committed and together really can deal with huge influences like the Port of Vancouver, or like government, or like major corporations, and protect where you live and what's important to you, whether it's environment, it's habitat, it's climate, it's just community. And so I think that what I will do is stop there for now and turn it over to Kate.
Thanks, Shane. Brings back a lot of memories, and I think one of the things that we need to realize is that when we did all of this, there was no social media. Use of home emails was pretty limited, and most of the things that we did was by picking up the phone and having phone trees. The other thing is that city staff had told Lafarge that the community would not care because we were just a working class community. There was some sense that somehow if you're working class, you don't care about the environment or where you live. And we definitely proved them wrong. And now I'm going to move into talking about the Trinity Street Christmas Light Competition. And the competition was something that featured spectacular beauty and incredible creativity. It was put together by Trinity Street residents who really stepped up for their community. Its roots, however, arise out of tragedy and an exceptionally difficult time for our community. In November of 1999, while we were still in the midst of battling Lafarge, Martha Elliott and Nora Davis, both seniors, were murdered in their homes on Wall Street 10 days apart. There had been a number of break-ins in the area prior to the murders, and those break-ins continued after. The community became gripped with fear. All we knew was that the murders had been the tragic results of break-ins that had gone wrong. With little information coming from the police, the BCA sprung into action to organize a response to the murders. We harnessed the organizing capacity we had built in the fight against Lafarge to generate action. We pressured the police for answers. We formed safety committees to look at ways we could make the area safer. This included fundraising for security features for those who couldn't afford them. We had crews of volunteers willing to install those features, as well as to clear shrubs and bushes in alignment with Block Watch recommendations. Despite this work, the fear persisted. People were still deeply afraid. I realized we needed something to bring people out of their homes they had retreated into. We needed to get people talking to each other again. People knowing their neighbors has always been one of our greatest strengths in Burrardview, and we needed to rebuild those connections. Our community safety work carried on into the year 2000, and it was that year that the Trinity Street Christmas Light Competition was born. The 2800 block of Trinity had always done a great job of decorating for Christmas. I'd noticed that our block, the 2600 block, was a close second. I talked to folks living in each block to see if there was interest in challenging each other to a Christmas light competition. We decided to make it fun and raise a little bit of money for the local hospice. Everyone would be able to vote for the best house and the best block. The catch would be that it would cost $2 per vote. People would be encouraged to vote early and vote often. Ballot stuffing was to become the order of the day. We let the rest of Trinity Street know what we were doing, and the 2500 block asked to join the fun. Trinity residents stepped up their decorating. Folks helped those who weren't physically able to do their own decorating. There may have been some good-natured ribbing of residents of other blocks. There was a bit of guerrilla decorating happening on the street where we'd rush across to someone who didn't have quite enough lights and put a few extras up for them. We printed up ballots which were distributed as far south as Dundas Street. The event was billed as one where people would be encouraged to walk the route and talk to each other. The idea was to get people out of their houses and interacting again. And it sure as heck worked. The street was teeming with people walking, and they were talking to each other. Hearing kids' expressions of delight was all the reward for their efforts that Trinity Street residents needed. Completed ballots were coming in. We had a prize of a helicopter ride for 4 that had been awarded to the best house, or that would be awarded to the best house. Bill across the street from us was running away with the votes for the prize. On the final day of voting, Jeff Westinda, who lived in the 2800 block, made a $2,000 donation and voted for his own house. It was the only ballot cast for that house, but under the rules, he won. I had the difficult task of breaking the sad news to poor Bill. The success of the event led us to do it again and invite the other 3 blocks of Trinity to participate. We created a new award because of what had happened the previous year. It was called the Jeff Westinda Ballot Stuffing Award for the largest single donation. The house with the most individual ballots cast for it would win the People's Choice Award. Jeff Westinda donated $4,000 that year and won the prize created in his name. Bill won the People's Choice Award and got that helicopter ride. In subsequent years, we added a street fair where people were encouraged to have house parties, do concession stands, and put together groups of carolers and find ways to raise money through those activities. There may have been a hot chocolate stand that would make your drink a little extra special for an additional donation. Then I got banned from doing that. The parent board at Harborview Childcare asked to be formally involved, and they contributed a great deal of time and effort to organizing the competition. And the money was split between Harborview and the hospice. We had a lot of fun and raised a lot of money, even after Jeff Westinda moved away. Unfortunately, as word of the competition spread, car traffic down the street increased to an unsustainable level. We tried everything we could think of to get people out of their cars, to no avail. Lots of folks had suggestions, but those all required too much volunteer power to carry out successfully. The pollution from idling cars was awful. There were fights, people were screaming at each other, and there were even some hit and runs. Much of what we had built was compromised by the traffic problems, including the amount of money we raised. Reluctantly, the decision was made to stop organizing it as a formal competition. The final one was held in 2014. We still struggle with traffic at Christmas time on Trinity Street, but I hold out hope that one day we can resume it as a pedestrian-oriented community building event. The community spirit that exists in Burrardview was what made the success of the competition possible. The people who live here know how lucky they are to live in this little slice of paradise. They are deeply committed to making this the best place possible, and they step up when called on to participate. And the light competition was just one of the many things that we have done to make us a really special place. And with that, I'll turn it over to Sarah.
Oh, thank you so much, Kate and Shane and Barbara. Kate, there were some comments that came through there. One from Wendy, just that they loved walking the lights, and thank you for all that work and background on how you made it happen. And one from Lana as well. that Lana was one of the ballot collector houses, and people were literally putting $5 bills through the mail slot. So some of the best mail ever, sounds like it. Yeah, thank you to all three of you. It's so interesting to hear those stories and understand, you know, because I've walked those lights. I've taken guests who are visiting me in the city to the lights, the same way I've walked the cherry blossoms, the same way I've sat in Burrardview Park or been in Meditation Park, or all of those little parklets along the way. So anchoring a bit to some of the work that has made those possible, and then starting to think about how we can continue that work and continue to have these green spaces and these community spaces be places that we're building safety in together, and building health in through community care. And I love that thread that I think ran through all of your stories of what happens when people come together, what happens when we connect, and really focus on that connection. And Shane, that the Eagles came back is like such a victory and such an honor. There's an elder who works with us at Hives for Humanity whose name is Veronica Butler. She's a firekeeper in community and is advocating at Crab Park for the waterfront and the access to the water, and one of the only parks along that stretch of land. And doing that in her way as an Indigenous elder, offering fire as medicine and fire as a way to bring people's attention. And she shared with me when I asked her what her vision was for this place that we all call home. And she said, you know, 10,000 units of housing for the people who are experiencing homelessness, and 10,000 units for the eagles who need homes too, and 10,000 units for the whales and the coyotes and the raccoons. And somebody was just sharing with me around the hummingbirds that are being found nesting on Burnaby Mountain, and just thinking about what happens when we listen to these more than human beings that are in our city, and how they can help us to protect this land. So I want to turn to the bees, which is the work that we do with Hives. I'm going to go back into sharing screen. So I was sharing that this was a little glob of honey on the finger of one of our beekeepers, Ian, at one of the harvests that we, you know, traditionally would hold in community to celebrate the year of work that has gone into keeping the plants from seed through all the water needed to grow them into flowering plants, so that the pollinators can collect the nectar and pollen that makes their homes possible and makes their growth possible. And I love this photo. It's one of my favorite ones from our years of Hives for Humanity since founding in 2012, because I think it shows this desire that I think is something that we can all connect to, that is perhaps like our shared humanity, which is to care for things outside of ourselves. And that when we reach into community and when we reach for connection, you know, whether it's to a little bee sipping honey from your finger, or to a neighbor, you know, that reach for connection and that desire to be in relationship is one that I do find over and over again transcends like socioeconomic boundaries, transcends communities, transcends like time and place, and is something that we can connect back to over and over again. So I'm going to talk a bit about the honeybee first. The honeybee is one of 20,000 species of bees in the world. We have about 450 species in these lands that are currently known as BC, and about 60, I think the number is 56 unique species of bee that are native to Vancouver. So the honeybee is not one of those. The honeybee is an uninvited guest, much like myself. And what gifts does she bring? And when we honor her and name her as an uninvited guest, what opportunity does that open up to think about our place here, and to think about how we connect, and to think about what we can offer back to this land for all that it gives us. This is moving inside a honeybee hive and to the bottom of a comb of bees. So this would be me lifting up a frame of bees and taking this photo of the bees doing what we call festooning. So they festoon by linking their 6 legs and their little hooked and padded sticky paws together. And this is how they build their comb that is the foundation for their lives, for their work, for their young, for their food. So while they're hanging, they excrete wax from between the segments of their abdomen. So this is a picture of a honeybee, a female worker honeybee excreting wax. She pushes that wax out. She's converting nectar and pollen and the minerals she collects from the water she forages inside of her body in fatty cells, transforming that into the fat that is beeswax, excreting that out. When it's fresh, it's actually like white like this. It doesn't have the color of the pollens that will eventually, it will become the golden or yellow wax that we're used to in our candles. That is pigment taken on from the pollens of the plants that the bees are foraging. So she pushes out that wax, she sculpts it up in her arms, she mashes it in her mandibles, and she forms it into the hexagonal comb that is this like iconic hexagon of the honeybee colony. So in this frame, this is a pollen frame where the bees have been packing pollen into the hexagons. And I hope what you can see is that there's a whole rainbow of colors. So pollen can be yellow, maybe from the dandelions somebody was mentioning. Pollen can be green or purple if you've got poppies growing in your yard. If you have maple trees in your neighborhood, that red pollen is a really important source of early forage for all kinds of bees. That maple pollen is bright, bright red. Later in the summer, especially along the railroad tracks where all those blackberries grow, the pollen from blackberries is gray. And one of the things that this frame represents to me is this diversity we find in our city, both of the plants and the people and the pollinators, and that diversity that is a really strong foundation for health. So when these bees have a diversity of plants to forage and they're collecting all these different colors of pollens, these are all different proteins. These are all different nutritional values that form a really healthy basis for the bees to live on. And when the bees have that diversity of forage, they are more resilient. When they have like a healthy, diverse diet, they're more resilient to the disease, to the pressures of the city and just of the world, so that they can take care of themselves if we give them that strong foundation of shelter and in habitat and food in forage. So when the bees are out foraging, it's all the worker female bees that are out foraging. So if you're ever seeing a bee in your life, unless you get really lucky and you're seeing two bees mating, which is really rare, honeybees mate in the sky at high paces. So it's really unlikely that you'll see a male bee unless you are inside of a hive. There are a couple of male bees on this frame. There's also a queen bee on this frame, and most of the other bees on this frame are worker bees. So I won't move my cursor to it quite yet, but you got the queen, who is central, who has got a really long, pointed, elongated abdomen. The worker bees, who are detail focused, most of them have their heads down doing work. And the glistening there is the nectar that they've collected that they're changing into honey. And then the male bees, who have really big eyes, really big chunky bodies, big wings, really made to be little flying capsules of the genetic information of their queen. So here with my cursor is a drone male bee, and here's another one, and there's another one jammed in here. And everybody else is a female bee. Most of them are workers, but then here we have the queen. And we've given her this yellow dot. That's a beekeeper tool, so that when it's one queen in a colony of up to 60,000 honeybees in one colony, that can be really hard work to find her. So the yellow dot just helps us find her. And then all of that foraging that they're doing helps them build this strong circular, protected by the honey at the shoulders, which is here, their brood in the center. So what's really important and what we work to do with hives is to transform spaces that may have been abandoned, may have been let go of, may have been deemed problematic or not worth the time, that get filled with garbage, that get left sort of bare, into pollinator meadows. And we do that alongside community. So this is 2017 and this is 2019, and that's at Cathedral Square Park. So this is some of the work that we love to do, because when we build those pollinator meadows and when we build them to include people who may have been seeking shelter in this space, may have been camping here in this housing crisis that we're in, that we leave spaces for people still to be welcomed while we still welcome in these plants and welcome in the pollinators that come with them. Because when we plant for diversity, we see this diversity of bees happening too. So these are two unique species of bumblebee that are indigenous, that are native to BC and to Vancouver, a rusty bottomed bumblebee here and a yellow banded bumblebee here. as well as a blue orchard mason bee here, another of our native bees, and then the, by now I hope, familiar honeybee, who you might recognize from Honey Nut Cheerios, etc. She's the one that most of us think of, but we have this really rich diversity, and when we plant gardens, we get these beautiful spaces that we can celebrate and take respite in for our human communities. We get the pollination service of the bees, transforming cherry blossoms into cherries and zucchini flowers into zucchinis, and apple blossoms into apples and blueberry blossoms into blueberries, etc. You know, bees are doing so much work for us, and what we can do back for them is grow plants for them and leave areas of undisturbed habitat for them. And at Hives, what we're working to do is grow this food and grow this forage alongside communities that are experiencing exclusion from the land, that may have been violently dislocated from land, that are experiencing poverty, that are experiencing this housing crisis and the homelessness that is a big part of it, that are experiencing the poisoned and illicit drug policy crisis, and yet are taking leadership roles and teaching others about bees and stewarding the land for the pollinators. So in the center here is Jim, who's one of our community beekeepers, who actually carried the first hive with me into the Hastings Folk Garden when we founded in 2012. And this is this year, as you can tell from the masks, working with a group outside at Soul Food Farms to learn more about the bees and how bees connect to food, connect to land, connect to community, connect to health. I spoke about Veronica a bit earlier. The other thing that happens when we grow gardens and grow green spaces with this intention of inclusion of all kinds of ways of knowing and being is that we have an opportunity to learn from and to support the vision of our Indigenous elders who have medicine and knowledge from time immemorial to share. So this is Veronica sharing 4 directions of medicine with us at our Hastings Folk Garden. This space has a traditional sweat lodge that Veronica has been a firekeeper of for over a decade, where she's hosted memorial and vigil for missing and murdered Indigenous women, where we have an apiary where we grow medicinal plants, where we're right beside Insight, the supervised injection site, and where we're just a half block away from Carnegie, Vancouver's oldest public library, where we have a free seed library. So much can happen when we start to think like bees, when we start to think of everybody as having a value, everybody as having a role, everybody as having something to contribute, and when we gather to build strong foundations. So this last frame is from a workshop we did thinking about beeswax comb, and thinking about the hexagons that are created by circles, the circles of plants and of community, that when we can unite these circles, we grow stronger. And when we start to think in circles instead of in squares, you know, when we start to like decolonize some of those like right angles and really rigid formats, what do we gain? And, you know, instead of thinking about those squares that we lose, like thinking instead about these like interlocking circles that we can gain and what comes from those. So we gathered plants from our community garden. There's some, I think, Joe Pye here, some Shasta daisies, a poppy, some wild, I can't remember the name of this one. It's not a dandelion, but it looks like one. Laurie Snyder would know. This is a plant that Laurie, who's a teacher, a Métis herbalist and teacher in community, has shared with me. Catmint, more poppies, fuchsia, like what can grow when we have this diversity and when we seek to learn from it and to think like bees. So thinking about casting our eyes up past the wild roses to the sky, thinking about the way that the bees fly and forage and connect us all, and hoping that we get to continue to grow and share story with each other in community. When I was living in Burrardview, I really wanted to make that little parklet at the bottom of, I think it's Slocan, right on the side of Burrardview, the one at the bottom. I so had a vision of wanting to be there and call it Contemplation Park as like a homage to Meditation Park. I find those little parklets so special, and the bigger park that anchors them all and the community that surrounds Burrardview there to be such a place of beauty. And so thinking about how we can continue to do what we did tonight, which is to come together and gather and share story, and how we might do that with the wider community. You know, thinking about who wasn't able to join tonight and how we might reach out to them, how we might learn from some of these stories of like going door to door and dropping off postcards, like knocking on neighbors' doors, like respectfully at a distance. And what might we gain when we all start to think like that? So I want to say another thank you to the presenters, Kate and Shane and Barbara, for sharing story and for accepting the invitation to kind of exchange story here. And what I always hope with our work at Hives is that we can start to see the mirror between communities and bees and learn from the bees and learn from our communities and really build those bridges of connection. Connection being this like central theme that I hope you heard in my story and that I definitely heard in all of yours. I'm going to ask MP to put a couple of links into our chat. So our Hives for Humanity website, the BCA website, the email to sign up for the BCA newsletter. We have a Vancouver Urban Food Forest Foundation email list too. So a recently formed foundation and one that Hives is offering this workshop tonight in collaboration with, and that we are hoping to do more work in the neighborhood around seeds and food and bees, thinking about what's already in Burrardview Park, the yarrow and the clover, and thinking about what else could be there, maybe some salal, an email to sign up for that newsletter, or the Facebook page if you're on Facebook, and then also Kiwassa Neighborhood House, a real anchor in the community, so their website as well. We are going to leave the room open. We'll stop recording just in a moment, but we'll leave the room open so that if you are here and would like to chat a bit more and move into maybe some questions, all of our presenters have agreed to give a bit more of their time. So thank you, presenters, for staying on and welcoming community to stay on. I just want to ask one more piece, which is another practice that we use at Hives, which is to close in the same way we open, to close in circle, and to close offering a way for more voices to come into the room. So a lot of you shared things that you're seeing in bloom, bleeding hearts and roses, Oregon grapes, tulips, more tulips, catmint, nettle, horsetail, gardenias and figs, really hearing this like diversity of things in bloom we're so lucky to have and that support the bees. Would you also offer a single word that has come up for you, something that you are reflecting on after hearing these stories? If you don't have one, I always offer buzz as like a pass, or honey, if you don't have a word. But if you have a word of reflection that you're able to put in the chat, something that's come up for you tonight. I'm seeing community and I'm seeing gratitude, and yeah, please keep putting them in and we'll collect them. We're going to share back like through the different newsletters and through those different links. So I'll save this chat, I'll harvest the flowers and I'll harvest the words, and then we'll share them back to you, because it's been my experience over and over again that in the words that are shared back, I see the story of the night, and in that way of reflecting and being in circle together, that we can carry this story forward. So a formal thank you again to all of the presenters, gratitude to all of you, gratitude to this land that we get to be on in this way, virtually gathering. And MP, if we can close the recording and then we'll open it up for people